In this lesson, we're going to discuss three key economic ideas. First, we're going to start with defining those three key economic ideas. What are the three key economic ideas? The first is that people are rational. This means that they take into account all available information when making decisions. The second is that people respond to economic incentives. So there are different motivations and things that drive people's behavior, but primarily people are responding to economic incentives, so what allows them to be better off financially. The third is that optimal decisions are made at the margin. So when people make decisions, they're making decisions and go ahead with action when the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. This means that they don't consider sunk costs or things that are already happening. They're looking forward so that if they take this action, what is the benefit accruing from this action, and what is the cost associated with the action? When that marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost, the person or firm goes ahead with the decision. What does it mean when economists say people are rational? That means that people are using all available information in order to take into account the cost and the benefits before they go ahead with any action. Firms do this when they conduct research, when they get quotes from suppliers, they conduct analysis on their previous sales and on previous performance when making decisions about the future. So we choose options and actions whenever the benefit outweighs the costs. Individuals and households do the same thing. Let's suppose that you want to plan a vacation. When you plan your vacation, chances are there's a list of places that you would really like to go to. So what you do is sit down and think about what are the activities, what are the things that we could do when we get there? What's it going to cost to fly there? What do hotel rooms cost? What's the price of food in those areas? What's the price of entertainment? What kind of entertainment are we going to see? And what you're going to do is you're going to take the action, you're going to choose the vacation that works best with the budget that you have and the benefits you're getting from that vacation. So firms do this and individuals and households do this. We research, we try to get as much information as possible, and then we weigh the costs and benefits before we go ahead with action. When we do that, we're acting rationally. Why do policy members need to consider secondary effects and unintended consequences? Because people respond to economic incentives and have different motivations that drive them. So one example is environmental policies. The purpose of these policies is to control pollution. What we're looking at here is a picture of Mexico City, and you can see the smog above it. One of the policies that was enacted in Mexico City to reduce the smog and air pollution was that cars were to stay off the road one day a week based on the license plate numbers. It was thought that reducing the amount of driving for each car meant that there would be less smog, less air pollution. But what happened is, remember that people respond to economic incentives. They have different motivations that drive them. So people need to run errands, they need to go to work, whatever the case is. So when families were thinking about purchasing a new car, instead of trading in their old car, they kept the old car, purchased the new car. So now they have two cars with different license plates, and that way they can drive all week long. Well, what happens if you have other individuals in the household? They may take out the second car on other days of the week. So what happened is that the number of cars on the road actually increased, and the smog and pollution increased as well. And people were keeping their older, dirtier cars with less environmental controls on them. So again, that increased the amount of air pollution. So this is why policy members really need to consider, what is it that's driving people to make choices? What are the economic incentives and motivations that people are responding to? Another example is policies that are put in place to protect endangered species. So what we're looking at here is the red cock-headed woodpecker. And so this woodpecker actually lived in a large part of the United States before European settlement. It lives in the longleaf pine ecosystem, which of course dwindled with European settlement and the timber and turpentine industries. Now that their territory is settled, there's less fire that clears the understory, and a lot of the pine forests are young as the timber industry cuts down the older trees and plants newer ones. It's thought that the availability of nesting cavities in older trees is thought to be the main factor limiting the number of breeding populations, because it takes them years to complete their nesting cavity in these older trees. This red cock-headed woodpecker was listed as endangered in 1979 when the population was about 10,000 birds. A lot of individuals who own this longleaf pine ecosystem type properties actually enjoy hunting, so what they do is they clear the understory to help attract deer and quail, and they also maybe are involved in the timber industry, so they might cut down small amounts of timber for sale, but because they still enjoy their land for living on and maybe hunting on, they're not as heavily involved in the timber industry. So those types of individuals actually create conditions that attract these birds because they're clearing the understory and they allow the older trees to stay around for a much longer period of time. When these birds are found on your property, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Agency will come in and they'll let you know that you have these birds on your property and that you can't legally cut timber half a mile within their nest. The thing is that they don't tell you where the nests are. So individuals who end up with this situation will end up having to expend money to hire biologists, figure out where the nests are, and then what they start to do is try to prevent conditions that make it favorable for this bird to breed. So if they were cutting down timber in like a 75 to 80-year rotation, they might switch it to a 40-year rotation. Their neighbors will start to do the same thing because obviously they'll hear from them how their property rights were restricted. So what ends up happening is that when people do find this bird on their property, they do end up killing the bird sometimes and not saying anything about it to anyone because they don't want their property rights restricted. So what has happened, unfortunately, is that in private lands, this bird is almost non-existent. Its population has flourished, but only in federal lands where there have been lots of programs and initiatives to increase the population for this bird. So again, it's important for policy members to consider the secondary effects and unintended consequences. So there were individuals who were making favorable conditions for this bird on their property, but because now their property rights were restricted, remember that we all respond to economic incentives, so they no longer want this bird on their property as it may infringe on their property rights. So when we're making policies to deal with the environment, to deal with endangered species, we have to try to balance what people are going to respond to and how they're going to react so that we can make sure that we get the desired result, which in the environmental policy example that we discussed was less air pollution and smog. So we want to make sure it actually turns out that way. And with the red cock-headed woodpecker, it's increasing the population of this bird. Again, we want to make sure that the policies actually do that instead of making conditions worse. And then another example is drive assist features. So as vehicle manufacturers increase the number of safety features in cars, it's great because it keeps us protected, but at the same time we start to pay less attention to our surroundings. Some studies have found that people were less likely to wear their seatbelts knowing that they had airbags. Maybe some people don't check their blind spots because their car has blind spot indicators that light up when something is in their blind spot. But the thing is, when those things malfunction, because we're not in the habit of paying attention to our own safety anymore, we're relying on something else to keep us safe, we may actually be putting ourselves in more danger. So again, all three of these policies that we discussed had good intentions, but it's important for policymakers to understand the secondary effects and how people are going to respond to these policies because they may get the opposite outcome that they intended. What does it mean to operate at the margin? Operating at the margin means that we take into account as much information as we can. We try to assess the marginal benefit and the marginal cost, and we only proceed with an action or a decision that we're making whenever that marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost. So for example, pharmaceutical companies sell medications at high prices in the US because the marginal benefit in the US needs to be high in order to cover the marginal cost of research, development, and production. And in the United States, because there are many buyers, the pharmaceutical companies get to set their own prices for new medications. So they're setting a high marginal benefit in order to cover this high marginal cost, because it does take many years of research. They need to compensate people for trials of the medication. And so the research and development is quite a high cost. These companies actually have many failed medications, many failed drugs that never make it to the market. So the ones that do make it to the market need to compensate the pharmaceutical companies for the marginal cost, not just of that particular medication, but all the others that have failed as well, in order for the pharmaceutical company to survive and continue research and development on new medications in the future. These same exact firms sell the same exact medication at deeply discounted prices in other countries. So why is that? Well, in the other countries, they don't have such a high marginal cost. All the cost of research and development has already been covered in the United States. So they don't need to cover that cost in these other countries. The other thing about them operating in other countries is that they negotiate with one buyer, which is going to be the government. So if the drug company doesn't want to sell these countries their medication at deeply discounted prices, then the governments in those other countries can just say, well, that's fine. We have our own pharmaceutical companies. We can look at your patents. We can see what you've done, and we can work around that to create our own medications. So drug companies in those countries will do the same kind of thing. They'll just learn from the US companies, develop their own drugs. So in order to eke out that additional marginal benefit, that additional revenue, pharmaceutical companies in the US are willing to sell medications at lower prices in other countries. Again, the marginal cost is lower there because they're mainly concerned with production in order to sell it there. The research and development cost has already been covered in the United States. So this is what it means to operate at the margin. When they sell their medications in other countries, they're not considering the cost of research and development because they don't need to. That's already been covered. Marginal means that we're looking at the next increment. So to get the next increment of benefit or revenue, they just really need to cover the cost of production and selling in this other country. And we call that cost of research and development that happened in the US the sunk cost. So when the company already has the medication developed, it's already being used in the US or going to be used or approved for use in the US, the research and development cost is already a sunk cost when they're thinking of selling it to other countries abroad. The main cost that they need to worry about with selling abroad is the cost of production and getting it into that country. That would be the marginal cost. Whereas in the US, when they're first deciding to develop the medication, the marginal cost is the research and development and production and trials and all of those things. That's the marginal cost in the US as they're deciding to first continue with research and development of this medication long before it's been approved. Once it's approved and they decide to sell in other countries, the marginal cost is only that production and getting it into other countries. So they don't need as high a marginal benefit. They don't need as high a drug price when they're selling in other countries. The marginal benefit only needs to be high enough to cover that marginal cost of production when they're operating in other countries.